Hi there, I'm Rosemary Barton. Here's what's at issue this week. Witness testimony wraps up this week for the inquiry into the Emergencies Act. We've heard from officials, protesters, and police who dealt with the blockade. This week, key ministers from the Trudeau government were asked to justify their use of the unprecedented act. Their reasons ranged from warnings from the commissioner of the RCMP.
She underlined for me that the situation in Coutts involved a hardened cell of individuals who were armed to the teeth with lethal firearms, who possessed a willingness to go down with the cause.
To concerns the protests could not be contained.
In case we need it, because the worst scenario would be something explodes and we are not ready to use it.
To worries about the economic fallout with businesses and the United States.
That one conversation was a seminal one for me, and it was a moment when I realized, as a country, somehow, we had to find a way to bring this to an end.
So what have we learned from the testimony this week and the decisions leading up to the use of the Emergencies Act? Let's bring in at issue Chantal Hébert, Andrew Coyne, and Althea Raj. Elamine is away this week. Good to see everyone. Kind of an extraordinary week in terms of the things that we got to hear about, the texts we got to see between people, and just the level of sort of curtain raising. Whether or not we got everything we needed is a different question, but that was kind of extraordinary. Althea, why don't I start with you this week on what you made of what we heard, and whether there was one minister in particular who made an awfully good case for the reason why the government needed this.
That's a very good question. So I will say I agree with you. Like the very interesting and juicy parts was how politicians talk to each other when they are in private. I think the fundamental question about this commission has been, did the government basically meet the threshold for the invocation of the Emergencies Act? And frankly, we don't have an answer to that yet, because the government has now come out and said that they have a Justice Department opinion that they could use a broader definition of what's actually in the act to invoke it. But we don't know when that opinion came. And we don't really know what that opinion says yet. So it's a little bit hard to judge whether or not the government was right to invoke it. And hopefully we'll have more answers about that tomorrow. I thought Minister Freeland today, she talked about economic harm to the country, not just what was happening at that exact moment in terms of the closures and the layoffs happening in Windsor, for example, with the Ambassador Bridge closure, but the risk if in the future for investment to Canada, that was something that weighed heavily in her mind. But part of her testimony, she talked basically about the federal government, the importance of the government being seen to act, how that was an important signal. And I think that is something we are probably going to hear a lot more about tomorrow. So I would say those are the few things that mark me. The one thing that I think we do need to talk about is that the reasons that were cited at the time have come out to not be so true. Like Marco Mendicino, the public safety minister, saying that he was acting on the basis of law enforcement advice. That clearly was not true. And so he's added a much more gray and has diluted his tone. And so that is also very interesting, what people say publicly and what they say when they're sworn under oath.
Chantal, what has struck you about where this gets us in what the Commission is trying to answer?
The Commission is trying not just to answer whether Justin Trudeau was justified in using the Act, but is actually, because it's the first time it's used, setting the bar on future reuse of the Act. And on that basis, I'm struck by the economic arguments. To me, it seems clearly that the government is trying to expand the notion of what is a threat to national security to cover economics. I can understand why they do it, but I wonder if they understand what they are doing in doing so. Because if that is going to be part and parcel of a national security threat, economics issue, then what do you do when you see an Indigenous rail blockade or an environmental protest? And are they really laying the foundation for more use of this act on all kinds of fronts that it wasn't meant to? Because the actual definition is, notwithstanding what CSIS has said, they should use it, but it's not the definition. Legally, it's the definition or the bar is set where the National Security Service bar is also set.
Although it does seem as though if anything has to come out of this, Andrew, it has to be some way updating what the Emergencies Act actually is, because I think what ministers have also said through the week is that it doesn't respond to the needs of today because of when it was created back in the 80s.
Yeah, there's a question there about do you take the law as you would like it to be or the law as it is? And that's not necessarily a cut and dried case. What I'm struck by through the whole 6 weeks of testimony is how complicated and ambiguous the events that they were dealing with were. You had something here that involved 3 levels of government and all the division of powers fights that go on between them interminably. You had the civilian power and the police and the separation of powers questions that raises. You had protesters with multiple leaders and multiple agendas, multiple unclear agendas, some of whom looked like they were completely nonviolent, some of whom looked like they had certainly the potential to be violent, and trying to figure out who was who. You had different protests in different places that raised different issues. And against all of this, you had a statute that had never been used, never been subjected to legal interpretation, to judicial interpretation. They were trying for the first time. We will see, as I say, whether the wording of the statute, whether it rises to the level of a threat to national security. A lot of people seem to think this is cut and dried. I don't think, given all those ambiguities, that it's entirely unforgivable to say there might have been legitimate differences of interpretation about how to apply it. It doesn't say they chose the right one, but we're left in the dark, finally, because they won't reveal, at this point anyway, what was the legal advice they received on this, on, I think, in some ways, legitimate grounds of solicitor-client privilege, but in the circumstances, it seems to me there's a pressing need to hear more about what was informing the government's decision-making on that particular point.
But haven't they, what we've seen this week, Althea, tried to shore up all the other reasons, the economic reasons, as Chantal points out, the reasons that there could be a threat in Alberta, whatever the reasons are, they've tried to shore up all the other reasons without having to reveal that key part that you and Andrew are pointing to.
Yeah, they've tried to broaden out what a threat really was, and that's what they're there to do, because they clearly wanted to do something. Yeah. I mean, Andrew is right about the jurisdiction. It's like the most Canadian story you can imagine. It is really about battles over jurisdiction. It lasted a lot longer than it needed to because of jurisdictional squabbles, whether it was Ontario telling Ottawa, well, no, the Ambassador Bridge is you, and Ottawa saying, no, the bridge ends in Windsor. It's the Windsor Police and the OPP. It's up to you to get involved. Like, it's worthy of a Veep episode or Yes, Prime Minister. So there's that part, I think, is really something that cannot be dismissed. But you can tell from the commissioner's questioning of the ministers, because after all, the lawyers get a chance to have a say, the commissioner asks some pointed questions, that he seems to be buying this argument about a broader definition, that there is a need for a tool, whether it was the Emergencies Act or not. It is the tool the government felt it was its only tool. And so they kind of have, it seems, gone back to adjust what the threat hole or the justification of using the act is, because they felt like they had no other options. They felt they needed to act or they needed to be seen to act.
Chantal.
Well, yes, but that's all great. And for whoever is applauding this today, this broadening for the circumstances, the economic reputation of Canada, keep in mind that this will lay the foundation for future governments that you may not like using the act. So it goes beyond it's fair game to say this, and it's fair game to rally to this. It goes to how you can access as a government this extraordinary power to get rid of a pesky situation. And for me, the economic arguments, as valid as they are, sound to me like a slippery slope.
Well, it also allows a government, I guess, Andrew, this is Chantal's point, to expand the definition every time they use it to justify the use of it, potentially.
Yeah, so I think we have to separate the use in this case versus possible future uses. I think in this case, given the murkiness of the whole thing, you could defend it as a kind of a kludge, that you had legal vacuums, you had unprecedented situations. I think more than peskiness, I think this is a very fluid and dynamic situation where the longer that law was basically openly flouted in Ottawa, the worse the possibility for that to spread with pop-up blockades across the country, with bad actors taking their cues from it. So it was a dynamic and potentially dangerous situation. But I think there's two things in addition to the narrow question of whether it was legally justified. I think it was practically justified. Whether it was legally justified, we'll see. But I think there's two other considerations we want to look at. One is, how did it come to this? How did we get into this mess where the government felt this was the only possible solution they could bring? But secondly, as you're suggesting, how do we make sure it never happens again? Make sure it never happens, i.e. we don't get into the situation again. But secondly, make sure that future governments can't use this very powerful law in too loosey-goosey fashion, can't use precedent of, well, they were able to get away with it this time, they should be able to do so in future. So that's where the commission is going to play a very key role, I think, in identifying what are the gaps in the current power. Maybe it needs to be adjusted, but how do we also make sure that governments don't abuse it in the future?
30 seconds to Chantal, then I'm taking a break.
Okay, so let's be serious. Most of us at this point, the three of us, kind of assume that even if the conclusions don't go in the way of the government's decision, public opinion has already cast a judgment.
Right.
So those are two things: broader definition and public approval, even if it doesn't meet the standard. There is no deterrent there for a government not to use it again for some purpose that suits it.
The public inquiry into the use of the Emergencies Act has heard from 3 of the Prime Minister's top aides.
There's a difference, too, between engagement and negotiation. And the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, the government, wasn't prepared to negotiate public health measures that were rooted in science.
Chief of Staff Katie Telford there talking about what was considered leading up to the invocation of the Emergencies Act last February. With the PM set to testify tomorrow, what could still come to light? Okay, let's bring back at issue. Chantal, Andrew, and Althea are all here again. Chantal, I'll start with you. I mean, it was interesting, again, to hear from the Prime Minister's top aides about what they were doing and thinking about as this was happening, but all eyes will be on the Prime Minister tomorrow. And I guess, what is the risk for him? Is there any risk? What does he have to sort of do to show to Canadians that that this was justified from his perspective?
Okay, so first, from the clip you played, Katie Telford was really addressing what could be a frail part of the armor of the Prime Minister, i.e., why didn't you talk to them?
Yeah.
Why didn't you try to negotiate your way out of this?
Exactly.
So, and it's interesting that she would go there and do it in that way. I believe the government, by and large, has won not the legal battle, that's for the Justice Ruler to decide, but the public relations battle on this. That this week the ministers could have contradicted themselves, come across as a kind of tripping over themselves to give advice that, even with the emails, I think they did okay this week. What Justin Trudeau needs to do is not rock the boat, not add a new twist in the narrative, frankly, because the narrative is pretty much set. And he needs to cap it with something that fits with the narrative. Sometimes Justin Trudeau does not do that, but I believe that he's disciplined enough that we will not learn great new things tomorrow.
So does that mean it's a fairly easy day for him, dare I argue, Andrew, or that he just has to stay, as Chantal says, just stay the course with what the narrative that his ministers have provided?
Well, there's other issues than just this particular case. I mean, as somebody said off the top, we've been seeing an unusual glimpse into the inner workings of government in general, this government in general. And one of the things I think we're going to learn a little bit about tomorrow is just how much is the Prime Minister engaged. This is a fellow who's often portrayed as being more a spokesman for the government than really heavily engaged in the details of government. So what will be revealing is how well does he understand the issues here? How good a case can he make for the details of the decision that were made? How much was he a part of the final decisions? Obviously, the buck stops with the Prime Minister, but it's going to be, Prime Ministers rarely sit down to this kind of intense, focused grilling by an expert interrogator or series of interrogators. And so it will be interesting to me just to see what we learn about this government agenda.
I mean, from everything I've been told, and Althea, feel free to jump in, he was deeply engaged. You know, whether he is able to articulate that tomorrow, I don't know. But it's my understanding that he was very engaged in the decision and the briefings. Althea.
Yeah, I think there's three things the Prime Minister probably will be asked to flesh out. First is the negotiations, which Katie Telford talked about today. I think also on the consultations with the provinces, I'll just remind you that Alberta and Saskatchewan both have lawyers at the Commission. Right. And there is a real question mark about whether or not the Prime Minister had already made up his mind. I think it's pretty clear he had, but that's my opinion, before he had a telephone call with the premiers that Monday on Valentine's Day. Mm-hmm. And then, you know, the wheels were already in motion to make this announcement. So I think that there will be questions about that and, of course, about the legal justification. But the one thing we haven't talked about is really that there's two shows happening here. There's a commission with Justice Rouleau, and then there's the convoy lawyer, who is on a whole other different planet when it comes to where you know, the commission is going. He has built a conspiracy theory that the Liberals were involved in a false flag operation, that the Nazi flags and the Confederate flags on Parliament here were actually agents of the government, people acting on their behalf. And he's letting these theories float. We saw that today with Minister Freeland out there. And he is talking about the fact that there's government overreach and there's a big conspiracy because of some of the documents have been blocked out. And with Ms. Telford, for example, he had a chance to ask her about why she didn't sit down, or the Prime Minister didn't sit down with the convoy participants. And instead, he spent his time asking about the notes of her aide and why things were blacked out in her aide's notebooks. You know, this does not make any sense because he's not talking to us. He is talking to people who already believe in a conspiracy theory. And so I think the Prime Minister it will be very interesting to see where the convoy's lawyer goes with the Prime Minister.
Chantal?
I think the lawyer we're talking about is actually an asset to the government's case, that there was no one credible to negotiate with. And he's been kind of an illustration of the kind of conspiracy theories that were prevalent within the convoy. So I'm, for one, think that his presence at the Commission was very useful, not just because it made that point, but because he raised issues that others did not. But I don't think that Justin Trudeau will have a hard time answering his questions.
Andrew?
He's accurately representing some of the concerns of his clients, I suppose you could say. When the agenda of some of these people was that the government should give way and step aside in favor of a junta of the Governor General, the Senate of Canada, and the protest leaders, you're not necessarily dealing with people who are fully informed as to how the real world works.
So for Justin Trudeau to walk away tomorrow, what does he have to answer those three things that you've said, Althea, and then we just sort of all move on and wait for the final report? I know there's other testimony from experts that's going to happen. Oh, Chantal wants to. Chantal, you go. And then Althea.
Yes, you do move on. Why do you move on? Because the Conservatives have never picked up on anything that happened over the past month and a half.
Very good point.
To raise it in the political arena. And the NDP has already said, whatever the conclusion, they're not going to be questioning their support of the government on this one.
Last word to you, Althea, quickly.
Oh, I would love for the Prime Minister to answer, but I would be very surprised if he does.
Look at how brief Althea was there. She really listened to me that time. I have to mark it. Okay. Thank you all for being here. We'll see where we're at next week. Appreciate it.